It's a pleasure and a joy to be here again with you, this time talking about indicators of addiction disorders in the EEG and other psychophysiological markers. And today, as always, I'm going to speak from a combination of what the research shows and from personal experience as well. Now, I will relate what I've seen in clients that I've seen in my 17-year career with different addictions, what we see in the brains of addiction, but also what other components, elements we need to take into account when it comes to working with addictions. Now, as always, we have some learning objectives for these webinars, and one of them is understand how addiction affects brain activity and influences behavior, because that's what we do. We want to understand how addiction to different substances or different stimulation can affect the human brain, how that in turn affects the individual, and how we work with that relationship between the ecosystem and the environment and what's happening internally, neurophysiologically, psychophysiologically in the person's organism. And then we want to explore the link between EEG findings and addiction behaviors and how that influences addiction, how that influences cravings, and then how cravings and addiction influence brain activity. So how the process normally goes full circle for the individual and how we need to understand that bi-directional relationship to better work with the individual. Now, we also want to integrate EEG with other diagnostic tools or other interpretation tools. I've always believed that the more information you can provide for a client, the better. And therefore, EEG, QEEG brain mapping is just one tool in an arsenal of tools that we can use to help the person have objective, reliable findings that they can utilize for healing. So obviously, the first thing we need to do is to understand what addiction means. And normally there's an official definition to addiction, but then it's also what the client, the addict themselves understand for addiction, what their loved ones understand for addiction, and what we as clinicians understand as addiction. It's very important to know this because anytime we work with a client, let's say they have depression, they're presenting with a pornography addiction, the way they see their addiction or their problem is not the same way we see it. It's in the eye of the beholder, of course. And so we need to work with that to optimize the understanding that we have and aim for the same goals when it comes to biofeedback or neurofeedback or brain spotting or psychotherapy or a combination of intervention. Now, what's very clear is that addiction affects millions of people yearly. And the cost is very high, not only financially, but it's also at the family level, society, healthcare costs, and the list goes on and on and on. So addiction is very expensive. It's very expensive to treat, it's very expensive to recover from, and it's very expensive not only financially, but also it takes a heavy emotional and psychological toll, not only on the addict themselves, but also on the ecosystem, family, government, society at large. And therefore, it's very important to understand that addictions are no joke, because sometimes society will underplay or undermine what an addiction is. And the common belief sometimes is that addicts make willful decisions and they could stop their addiction anytime. And this mentality, of course, does not help. And again, this affects children. If you're a parent and you're an addict and you have children, it will impact your kids. It will impact your parents. If you're a minor or you're an adult who's an addict, it will impact your parents, your spouse, your extended family, first responders if they have to come save you because you overdosed. And obviously, some people transition into committing crimes just to sustain their habit. So it's a huge problem. And it's not only working with the addict, it's how do we extend that circle when it comes to helping. So it affects all levels of society, as I was explaining, school system, neighborhoods, healthcare. I mean, this is widespread knowledge, yet many people don't understand it. And we need to provide more education about addiction, not only how it affects the brain, but also how it affects everyone. And again, it's underrated, it's undermined. Some people don't know where to go for help. Some people go for help and they don't get the help they need. And again, society undermines addiction as a will problem. The addict lacks will. They lack self-control. I could never get there myself. I could never eat my way into obesity. I could never, watch pornography to destroy my family. Well, people always think that way until they fall prey to the addiction, and then the mindset obviously changes. But there's a lot of ignorance, and sometimes deliberate ignorance when it comes to addictions. And our job is not only to, train that brain. Our job is to train that brain to help society at large and create a chain of events that percolates everyone in a positive way. It is misunderstood. Again, there's the ignorance, there is the lack of knowledge, the lack of education, and therefore people will lie to themselves. Self-denial, it's a very dangerous thing when it comes from the addict, when it comes from their codependence, and when it comes from society at large. We tend to be rather psychopathic, and we lack empathy many times for people with addictions. Now, some people with addictions will do some terrible things like kill, steal, hurt, but a large percentage of addicts got there and they are good people, they're human beings. Yet, sometimes we don't treat them as such. We see them as weak individuals who just don't want to get out or are making excuses. And of course, it goes beyond that. So there's a fine line when it comes to working with addiction. There's that double-edged sword. We have to be empathetic, but we also have to be tough, for lack of a better term, on the individual with the addiction. So now, when it comes to working with the individual, they come for a brain map. We help them understand we are facilitating healing for everyone involved, even for us as clinicians. When we work with somebody, their problems, their condition, their situation, their pain will affect us whether we want to or not. Many of us tend to be rather compassionate clinicians who truly care for the individual we're working with and their ecosystem. And this will impact us. So we need to be very, very mindful of that. We need to be mindful of how we extend the healing, how we facilitate it. Let's look at what happens in the brain. That's why you are here today. You want to understand what we can find in the brain of the addict. So first thing we need to understand is that addiction hijacks the brain. And this is important because, again, everything we do in neurofeedback is a chicken and egg problem, right? What came first? Well, to me, and to some of you, is a chicken and egg problem. It's not what came first, is which one is more salient at the time. But there's always an interaction, meaning what caused the addiction? Was it trauma that made the individual an addict, or was it the addiction that traumatized the individual? And it's always both. If you have enough experience working with individuals, you know it's both. And that's very important to understand, because when it comes to the intervention, you need to know what the dynamic is like and how you target that dynamic. Meaning, do we address the neurotransmitter problem first? Do we provide the dopamine by means of exercise, by means of behavioral activation, and then we do the neurofeedback? Do we do the neurofeedback first and then we provide the supplements, or do we do that simultaneously? Every case is different. But what's important to understand is, as a clinician, we need to dive as deep as we can in understanding the dynamics. And this is a rather individual and personalized process. It's an individualized and personalized process, meaning everybody is different. You can take a group of 10 alcoholics, their life story is different, their addiction dynamics are different, the brainwave patterns may be different. And this we need to understand. How are we going to go deep into this person's world, into this person's universe, and how we're going to take that into account? So how do we provide for the lack of dopamine? How do we target the dysregulation in the serotonin? How do we address the neuroinflammation? How do we address the other elements that play into this equation? That's very important to know. But that's what's important to know is there's a hijacking of the brain, meaning at some point the individual isn't making a conscious decision. Yes, they're using, but how much of that is deliberate use? How much of that is the brain is asking for it and it's beyond their control? It's beyond their will. It's beyond saying, oh, you know what, I'm not going to use today. I can get this under control. And that's very, very important to understand. And if you understand that, and if you understand what you're seeing in the brain map, in the EEG and you have a much stronger chance of optimizing brain function and optimizing healing. And again, this hijacks the brain by targeting the limbic system, the frontal lobes. It reduces impulse control. It depletes your dopamine, and the only way you can get dopamine is by using, or by gambling, or by watching pornography, or by whatever it is that you're addicted to. So it takes away your ability to have that self-control and that self-regulation. It creates excess beta waves, and then your arousal gets really high. And when your arousal is really high, you have to use so you can bring the arousal down. But then once you bring the arousal down, you feel guilty. And then the cycle starts again. So how do we break that cycle of helplessness to empowerment? Every time we see a client for neurofeedback, they're helpless, they're hopeless. We need to move them to empowerment. How do we empower them? How do we teach them the skill sets that they can use in the real world to be better? So again, we have conscious control and not conscious control. So people use deliberately. Sometimes when people use or they succumb to the addiction, they're not aware of that. Not 100% at least. And again, we're walking the tightrope. This is rather a fine line, of course, and it's open to debate, just like everything else in human as it pertains to human existence. Right? Death penalty, addictions, gambling, alcohol. It's open to debate. But what we have to understand is that as clinicians, as brain scientists, it's a job to educate people into saying, it's not as simple as willpower. One of the elements that worries me the most about addiction is how it inflames the brain and how it will target glia cells. And that's a very dangerous process, because once you start losing glia cells due to addiction or due to a traumatic brain injury or due to psychological stress, you're more prone now to experience mental illness. So if you have a family history of depression, if you have a family history for schizophrenia, if you have a family history for bipolar disorder, addiction won't make it any better for you. So now we're going into uncharted territory, and things get more complicated. The plot thickens, because now you not only have an addiction, you're dealing with an addiction plus a mental illness. And that makes things 10 times as complicated and complex. Now, let's go and see what happens in the EEG here. We have, of course, some biomarkers. What's important to understand, though, is that biomarkers not always indicate one thing. They can point us in the right direction, but as I always say when I teach these classes, you have to think outside the box. And I always suggest to people that they start thinking of possibilities that may sound far-fetched, may sound insane, may sound ridiculous. But I say that because many times in my career, I have come up with the problem for the individual. We see the EEG pattern, we have a clear understanding, or at least clear knowledge of the symptom, but we don't know what's causing it. And a couple of times when I start thinking of the possibilities, I start thinking of the most ridiculous of them. And a couple of times I've been right. So I'm not trying to brag here. I'm just saying, as a clinician, it's important to think outside the box and think differently. Because sometimes you'll see the pattern you will think is X or Y, and it turns out it's Z. So X, Y, or Z, which one is it? We have to think outside the box. So we can use the EEG to understand the patterns, to understand the biomarkers, but we need to use the EEG to think deeper, to broaden our horizons when it comes to interpretation and finding what the problem is or what the problems are. So we look at amplitude and we look at frequencies. And in some cases, we will see very high amplitude. In some cases, we will see lower amplitude, even for the same group of addicts. In some marijuana addicts, we may see high power in very slow frequencies, and sometimes we can see low power fast frequencies. So not all people are built the same, and not all people react to addiction the same way, and not all brains respond or change to addiction the same way. And a very important exercise and a very humbling exercise is if the person is coming for a brain map for an addiction, what I normally do is I try to imagine what that EEG is going to look like. And I will say, you know what? I bet I'm going to see excess gamma waves. And then when I look at the EEG, there's alpha waves or theta waves. And I go, that's interesting. I never expected to see this presentation with this kind of addiction. But it keeps you humble, which is very important in our field, and it keeps you open to learning. Again, if we feel that we've seen it all and we know it all, then we are failing our clients. We're just boosting our ego, but we're not doing any service to clients and society in general. So it's important to understand that patterns may look different, may look the same. We need to see what the case is and what dynamics are. In alcohol, for example, we can see increased beta, but we can see lack of alpha. We can see maybe some gamma. So these are some general guidelines for you to use when you see the EEG and to understand how the addiction plays out. Okay. So some alcoholics will present with high or faster beta. Some may not. And the next step, once we see something in the EEG that we were not expecting to see, the next question that we need to ask, the next question I always ask is why? Why is this happening? What's causing this pattern to be different for this individual? And if you ask that question, that hopefully sparks that curiosity in your system. And that means, okay, let's go read now. Let's search the research. Let's go read some papers. Let's ask other people. And that will help you get to the answer. And that broadens your knowledge and your experience. Now, let's see, for example, this is an EEG with beta spindles. This is an alcoholic individual. So they came to me for alcohol addiction. They want to get better. And the first thing we did was to do an EEG and the QEEG. And as you can see, this individual has diffuse beta spindles. They're high amplitude. Normally, beta spindles are lower amplitude, low voltage, but as you can see, they have a lot of fast activity, but high amplitude as well. So now that's the brain giving you a clue. It defeats your current paradigm, which is beta is usually low voltage and it's very fast. Fast indeed, not so low voltage. Now we need to understand, why is this brain firing more? What's causing it to fire more? And how is this impacting the individual and their ecosystem? And so then you can look at the spectral displays. And indeed, you can see that, there's very high amplitude. And what's interesting to me is that we have the persistent beta 13 to 21, which normally is useful for the individual. But when a pattern becomes repetitive in the EEG, when a pattern is persistent in the EEG, that's when it is problematic. So something I teach in my classes is look for how often, how frequently, and how long the pattern lasts. If it is longer than a second in time, if it is persistent over time, that brain is telling you something is wrong and is signaling for you to pay attention to it. And that's what we see here. And what's more interesting is that we have a 16 hertz. So it's peaking around 16, 17 hertz, which is not really that fast if you think about it. But the problem is, if we go back to the EEG, to the raw EEG, is that this is a persistent pattern. Now, when we see this, what's the first thing we need to rule out? A medication effect. Normally, SSRIs or benzos will give you a diffuse fast beta pattern. This individual is not on medication. So this is purely the effects of alcohol plus combined with other elements. So some neuroinflammation because of the alcohol, some neuroinflammation because of food, some neuroinflammation because of the environment. But now we're connecting the dots and putting the pieces to the puzzle together so we can have a clear image of what's going on here. And you will see that the highest amplitude comes from the anterior cingulate, FZ. This is important. And why is it important? Because now we're venturing into territory that goes beyond the addiction. I will speak to this a little bit later. But what's important to understand is we have a salient region with a salient pattern that now gives us clues as to why this addiction is manifesting the way it is manifesting. So it's pointing to the dynamics for this individual. But you can also see that we have some higher excess on the right temporal region, which could impact the insula, and then definitely in the back of the brain, which is an area that's important for self-regulation. So again, chicken and egg problem. Is it because there is inflexibility here that we have an addiction problem, or has the addiction created the inflexibility? The answer is both. Both play a role. One may have a more important role, meaning it's presenting more heavily, but both will have an influence. And then we can be precise with Loretta or S. Loretta to look for the distribution, the propagation of the signal, and understand where in that brain the problem is. One of the things that I like the most about QEEG, QEEG, is that we can help the individual understand the why. The individual will come to us with a list of complaints. They don't know why. They think they know why, or they may have a broad idea of the why, but we can tell them with more precision, why are you behaving this way? Why are you feeling this way? Why are you drinking uncontrollably? From your brain perspective, of course. So we can see distribution, the areas involved, and we can tell them, look, this area of the brain here is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is involved in cognitive flexibility, which means that if you are stuck in a pattern, it's gonna drive you to drink. So now we need to tell your brain to slow down and take it easy so that you can take it easy on the drinking. Is it going to happen overnight? No. Is it a process? Yes. But now we have a more clear vision, and now we have an objective that we aim for. And so you can do that in the beta distribution. You can see the EEG to the spectra to the more specific imaging. So beta, you can see in alcoholics, but excess beta you can pick up in somebody with a cocaine addiction, with a heroin addiction, sometimes in marijuana addiction. It's rare, but I've seen it. So again, it breaks the status quo for you, and it should. So if you look at that beta excess, look for medication effects. If they're not medication effects, why is this happening? What's the dynamics? Okay. Now, in cocaine, some research points to lower frequencies. Interesting. So we have a slowing of the brain with a substance that apparently speeds it up. So that's why we need research. Yes, research makes things more confusing at times, but research gives clarity at the same time. And it's important to understand research is not perfect. The objective of research is not to be perfect. The objective of research is to provide answers. So assuming that these individuals conducted the studies in a very ethical way, in a quite ethical way, then we're going to trust the data. And the data in this case points to low blood flow, which is hypoperfusion, which gives you a theta or an alpha presentation. And you go, well, but that doesn't sound right. I mean, I've seen EEGs of cocaine addicts and they're fast for the most part. For the most part being the key word. Not everybody will present with the same pattern. Once we see this, once these researchers find this, what's the next step? Why? Why are some people in cocaine abstinence or with cocaine addiction would present delta waves or theta waves or alpha waves? Why? Maybe the word abstinence is the key. The substance gets you going so much that when the brain misses that, the brain gets bored. Just like when it's the weekend and you don't know what to do. You look at the movies, there's no movie that gets your attention. You say, let's go out and play golf, but it's too hot. And you don't decide what to do, you get bored. So when you get bored, your body feels tired, you just feel apathetic. So when you don't have that thing that gets you going, that motivates you, your brain just becomes tired and loses interest. That could be the case. But there could be some kind of metabolic demand that is not being met. There's a metabolic dysregulation or transformation that we need to look at. Because the brains of addicts, just like the brains of anybody else, once they go through a rough experience, are never the same. So we need to teach that brain the adaptability to the new environment. And addicts will always be addicts. They can be in recovery and they could be sober for 30 plus years, they're still an addict. So we still need to understand how the brain it's acting on a day-to-day basis. And the same goes with tobacco. Now, I have very interesting stories when it comes to tobacco smoking. Many years ago, I would say maybe 10 or 12 years ago, we did a study with a university in Colombia, where I was living at the time, and we started using audiovisual entrainment technology. So we decided to use audiovisual entrainment for academic performance. So we got together with the folks from Mind Alive, who very kindly provided us with the equipment. And the purpose was to prove that our working hypothesis was that audiovisual entrainment would enhance academic performance. Interestingly, we gathered a lot of data from the participants. These were college students, undergraduate college students. And in the forms that we provided, a large percentage of them reported smoking cessation. It was not the intended purpose of the research, but it's a satisfactory and quite interesting gain that we had as a consequence of that. And I've done with neurofeedback with many individuals in my career, and many of them never told me they smoked, even denied it when I asked. But interestingly, as we did the neurofeedback, they would come clean and confess and say, look, I never told you this, but I smoke. And now I'm not smoking anymore because the neurofeedback is helping me do it. So does neurofeedback help with smoking cessation? Yes, it will. Does it work for everybody? Perhaps not. I don't think it will, but does it work for a large percentage of people? Yes. And so sometimes you will find with your interventions that you have this additional gains that were not initially the main target, but it does happen. And again, the EEGs of smokers will vary. It will vary from in their activity. Here in this research, some found that they have decreased delta and theta. Some find that they have increased beta. Some find there's a dopamine issue. Some find there's a GABA issue. It's different for everybody. But what's important here is that we see a general consensus and we have a general construct as to what we can find and how we can orient our findings for the intervention. And interestingly, too, those individuals in this research who accidentally had the smoking cessation, we did a follow-up with them 3 and 6 months later, and they were still not smoking. And in a lot of the research with neurofeedback, as it pertains to addictions, it's been found that about 70 to 80% of individuals who undergo neurofeedback for addictions have not relapsed 3 years later. Compared to individuals who do the 12-step traditional programs, those individuals normally relapse within the first year. With neurofeedback 3 years later, have not relapsed. That's very, very powerful. So if we can provide people with a better and stronger fighting chance, why not, right? This is too much info. I'm not going to read it. It just says people have deficient delta, deficient theta. Some people have excess alpha. Some people have excess beta. It changes. Now, let's talk about marijuana, because again, marijuana is one of those substances that it's quite controversial. Of course, many people defend the apparent fact that it is harmless, that it's only has positive side effects, but we have the tools to really determine if that is the case or not. And again, in this research right here, some of the research, they have found that there's hyperconnectivity in the theta and alpha bands as it pertains to marijuana, to cannabis. So let's see from our experience what we find. This is the EEG of a pot smoker. This is an engineer. He came to me a few years ago, a 37-year-old engineer. He would be 43, 44 years of age now, still young. 37 at the time, civil engineer, has his own business, very successful. And he came to me saying, I feel very slow. My memory is horrible. My learning, I don't know what's happening to it. I feel tired. I feel brain fog. That's all he told me. And I said, okay, don't tell me anything else. Let's run your brain. Let's scan your brain and let's allow your brain to do the talking. And this is what the EEG had to show. This is eyes open, by the way. You can see the high amplitude, high power, slow alpha everywhere. As soon as I saw this, I go, I'm going to take a wild guess and think that marijuana is involved here. He hadn't told me. And he said he was feeling stupid. That's one of the things he said. So when I start giving the info back to him, I show him the EEG and I explain what amplitudes and the frequencies mean. And then I show him the spectral displays. And I will say, the reason you're feeling all very stupid and slow is because your alpha waves, especially in the back, are slowing down. And it's because of all the pot you're smoking. At this point, his eyes go wide open and he looks at me and he tells me, how do you know? I said, well, I have some experience reading EEGs and I've seen this pattern before and that was my first suspicion. So you're confirming to me that that's the case. And he says, yep, that is exactly the case. And then he continues to say that, he thought it was harmless, and that a lot of his friends do it and they seem to be doing fine. I said, well, your friends may be doing better than you. It doesn't mean you're going to do as well as them. Everybody's different. And this is what marijuana is doing to your brain. Now, why was he using marijuana? That's, again, the fine line and the controversy. Well, he grew up raised by his mother, and his mother was a cocaine addict and alcoholic, and a narcissist who was psychologically abusive. His father abandoned him when he was, if I recall correctly, he was 5 years of age when he abandoned them, and he was raised by an alcoholic, cocaine addict, and a narcissist. Well, a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress, trauma stands to reason why they use. Am I condoning it? No, I'm not. Am I understanding it? I'm doing my best to understand it. So again, he was using because the marijuana helps him calm down. But it's now slowing his peak alpha frequency, which at age 37 is 9.03 hertz. And I explained to him what the alpha does as we grow up, and then what it does as we age, and why it is important to protect your peak alpha frequency, and why it is important to keep a balanced brain. So this helps us understand the client, which helps us give him even more options. And you can see that, the theta, now it's creeping up here. And if he keeps on doing this, he's going to slow the alpha even further. So by the time he's 40, 45, he's going to have the brain of somebody who's like 80 years old with dementia. Not that he will develop dementia, but it's going to be a similar pattern and a similar dynamic. And that was enough to scare him, which was not my point, but it was enough to scare him and convince him that he needed some help. And so we got on board. Now, this is before the days of photobiomodulation, even before I learned about it. This is about 7, 8 years ago. And today I would have started photobiomodulation for them as well, in combination with the neurofeedback. This is his database comparison. So I ran this more recently because the tools are available now. And look at his alpha from 8 to 10 hertz in the absolute and the relative power. He's waking way more than people his age. And the alpha 2 is starting to show up. Some of the beta, the anxiety because of his trauma history, and then the theta, the delta, and specific locations. But alpha, look at that. So compared to his peers, his healthier neurotypical peers is not doing as well. And look at the alpha. Peak alpha frequency at eyes open shows up at 9 hertz, age 37. At this point, it should be at a minimum 9.7, faster the better, but it is slowing down. So marijuana is not as harmless as we make it out to be. And I can also look at his connectivity. This on the left is the 3D rendering of his absolute relative power alpha. Look at that. It's all over the place. So his whole brain is slowing down. And if you look at the connectivity, if I go back to the raw EEG for a moment, or rather clean EEG, you can see the hypercoherence, the phase stable alpha front to back. So alpha is everywhere. We can see it in the topo maps, and we can see the 3D rendering, and we can see the hyperconnectivity. Phase stability drives up coherence. So we have hypercoherent alpha front to back. It's just hypercoherent alpha that is slow. So his brain is a mess because there's slow alpha everywhere. That's not conducive to anything good in cognition, in emotion, in behavior, in anything. So these images were strong enough to make the point, to get the point across. And it's very useful because in my experience, people respond to the data. And if they respond to the data, they're more open to it. And again, we have abstinence. What happens when people don't use? They want to quit cold turkey. They got imprisoned for a crime, for stealing, and they're not being able to use. They go into a rehab facility. Well, abstinence can affect the brain. Not in a positive way initially. And that's why we need to understand the dynamics. So today with the technology, we can scan a brain at a baseline the person has been using for X amount of time. We scan them as a baseline. We scan them through the intervention. But if they're part of an abstinence program and we want to do research, we can also scan that brain and understand what the patterns are. And again, you hear about slow alpha in marijuana consumption. You hear about fast alpha in alcohol consumption. But as you can see, and I've showed you some examples that sort of break the mold. And hopefully they give you an idea as to what to look for and what to expect. Now, other forms of addiction, pornography, gambling, they have similar patterns to other substances, okay? And again, they will vary from individual to individual, okay? So we need to understand how the EEG presents itself and how it impacts functions like problem solving, executive functions, psychomotor performance, brain processing speed, and we can do all that. So if you're interested in getting the list of research for this presentation, we'll be more than happy to provide it for you. You can type my email or some email that they can write to get this. We find I don't want to spend too much time, reading, because it's not the point. The point is there is the research that shows it, and you can compare the research to your own findings, to your own experience. Okay, I've been doing this for 17 years. Some of you out there might be doing it for longer. Therefore, you can use the info that I'm giving you here compared to your own experiences, compared to the research, and that broadens your knowledge base. That's the whole point. Now, there's another tool that I think it's quite underrated, and we need to understand to help with addictions or any other condition for that matter, is heart rate variability. Heart rate variability is not widely used by a lot of neurofeedback practitioners, and I think that's a big mistake, because heart rate variability is a strong indicator and a strong predictor of health and wellness or disease. So doing HRV metrics alongside your EEG recordings is something that I strongly recommend, because there's a strong relationship between heart rate variability, what the heart is doing, the health and state of the heart, which will influence the health and state of the brain. Most systems today have the capability of recording EEG and EKG simultaneously. I use two systems, which are MITSA, and with MITSA, you can record EEG and EKG simultaneously. And this is a graph from the iSync Me, the gray helmet from iMedicine, the South Korean company, which also records EEG and HRV simultaneously. And we have a female, 49 years of age, with an alcohol problem. And we can look at the metrics. You can see that their parasympathetic nervous system is 86% dominant over the sympathetic nervous system. Now, at rest, we want the parasympathetic nervous system to be higher, but maybe a ratio of 60 to 40, maybe 50-50. So 60 here for the parasympathetic, 40 here for the sympathetic. Now, this is somebody who's doing very well. And if you look at the SDNN, that's a very important number. At age 49, the SDNN for this lady should be 80 or higher, and we are at 35. Poor heart rate variability in alcoholism is not good news. It increases her chances of mental illness, physical illness, chronic illness. It's a risk factor, especially if you have a family history of, let's say you have a family history of cancer, family history of diabetes, family history of autoimmune conditions, psychosis, anything you have a family history of. If your heart rate variability is poor, you have a higher chance of developing these conditions down the road. Doesn't mean you will, but I don't think that's odds you want to play. I don't think that's a risk that you want to take. So measuring EEG and heart rate variability simultaneously, it's highly advisable. If you don't have an amplifier that measures that, you could buy a system that allows you to record the heart rate variability, and you can export the data to a program like Cubios and look at your metrics. And I also suggest that heart rate variability biofeedback is a part of your interventions, that you use heart rate variability as well as neurofeedback, heart rate variability as well as photobiomodulation, heart rate variability plus neuromodulation. It's a very, very, very strong tool. Now, before we go into the questions, the two things I want to say is that you also need to look at other components in addiction. One of them being OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. The research, the meta-analysis of the research shows that 1/3 of addicts have obsessive compulsive disorder. Again, chicken and egg question. Is the OCD responsible for the addiction? Is the addiction responsible for the OCD? We treat them as they're 50-50. At least that's what I do in my experience. The OCD can cause addiction, but the addiction can feed into the OCD. Is it possible to recover from addiction if you don't recover from the OCD? I don't think it is. And is it possible the other way around? I don't think it is. So you have to target both of them. And then the other component is trauma. I consult with a rehab facility in Thailand, and every day they send me EEGs for analysis. I fly to their facilities once or twice a year to work with their population. And I've looked at maybe a couple of hundred EEGs from their population. And the one thing I find is that 95% these addicts have trauma history. They have trauma markers in the brain. So again, do we target the addiction without targeting the trauma? It's not going to work. It's not going to be as effective. It's not going to be as efficient. Can we target the trauma and not target the addiction? Equally, not as effective, not ideal. So what do? We target both. And they have a holistic system. They do photobiomodulation, they have neurofeedback and biofeedback, they have brain spotting, they have EMDR, they have different forms of psychotherapy. They are now involving nutrition as part of their programs. So again, we need to look at things more thoroughly. With that in mind, I would like to open the floor for any questions you may have.
John put a question in the Q&A. So he said, I am in a conversation on LinkedIn where the regulation circuit pathways of addiction was largely dismissed in favor of the traditional psychosocial approach. I don't think the treatment recovery community has yet to really embrace the value neuromodulation can provide in helping addicts find wellness. I'd love your thoughts on how to bridge this divide.
Hi, John. Good to have you here. It's a very common problem that I find as well. There is unfortunately a lot of resistance from the more traditional counselors and psychologists and medical professionals. The only thing I can think of to bridge the gap is to do a lot of psychoeducation. And if you follow my career, one thing that I do is that I do a lot of education and a lot of outreach. So I fortunately get invited to a lot of organizations because they hear about my work from someone else who knew me. And I do demos. I take the equipment with me. I hook people up. I explain the process. I meet some skeptics here and there, but I've come to a point where I don't worry about that. You know, if I'm doing a demo for a group of, let's say, 50 individuals, at least 2 or 3 are going to be skeptic and they're going to challenge me and they're going to question me. I answer the questions to the best of my ability, and that's it. I know that I'm not going to change their mind. It's not my objective to change their mind. What I know is that most of the people there, more than 50%, will have an interest in spite of the skeptics, in spite of the challenges. And my suggestion is that you do outreach in every which way you can, through your YouTube channel, through podcasts, through doing demonstrations. You know, to this day, I still solicit. Sometimes I do. A couple of years ago, a colleague of mine said, how do you do what you do? How do you get to do what you do? I said, you have to solicit. I did a lot of soliciting in the first years of my career because nobody knows who you are. You have to go and get your name out there. So I would write to hospitals, I would write to rehab facilities, I would write to anybody I thought would be interested in doing this, in learning about this. And did I get rejected? You bet I got rejected. 90% of the time. All it takes is that one person who's willing to listen to you. And that's how you get things in motion. That's how you get the momentum. It's not really about convincing people. I don't think that's the way to go. If you do good work, if people are happy with the way you help them, the word will spread. There will always be skeptics. But one thing that I'm happy to say is now that I'm teaching more, I'm seeing more medical professionals in our trainings. I recently did a training in Romania and we had 150 people and we had about 5 or 6 psychiatrists, maybe 5 or 6 neurologists. This is not something that I would have seen 10 years ago. People are becoming more open and they're embracing this. And if you have a testimonial, you know, it doesn't have to be openly there, but if you have testimonials, this will help. The best way to bridge the gap is to continue doing our job with passion, to continue doing it responsibly, to continue doing it ethically, and some people will listen. You know, the principle is some will, some won't, but so what? Somebody's waiting. So that's where that's where you work. And that would be my suggestion and my recommendation.
That was such a great quote. I feel like we should just end the presentation there. That was, I don't know, that was just a really good closing statement.
And that's not my quote, by the way. It's from a book called The Success Principles. I don't want to.
Okay. Well, yeah, that was good. Thank you so much, Santiago, and thank you everyone for attending. So we'll see you next time.
Thank you guys. Have a good evening.
See you soon. Bye.